Today's lecture is about the Presocratics and the beginning of philosophy. What we want to talk about today is try to find or get our fingers on, if we can, the origins of philosophy. How did it get started? Where did it come from? How did it get started? And then once it got started, let's take a look at the various branches or subdivisions of philosophy as they develop early on in its career. So philosophers ask two key questions. You could boil it down, and it becomes very complicated and subtle and nuanced, but basically you could boil it down to two questions. Why and what is it really? A lot of times when I ask students what are those two questions, the first thing that comes to their mind is why. That's not a problem. Everybody understands that. If I say, okay, what's the second question? Very frequently, the second question that students propose is how? And as it turns out, philosophers are not particularly good at asking the how question. And in fact, there is a group of people, a class of thinkers who are quite talented at asking the how question. Those are your scientists and technologists. They are very fine at asking the how questions, but philosophers tend to ask why and what is it really. And they ask these two key questions about everything. Anything that's not nailed down can be asked about as far as philosophers are concerned. Why is there something rather than nothing? What is all this, all we experience? What is it really? These questions, can be subversive. Not everybody likes to have the status quo question, especially if that status quo happens to be working for somebody. Nobody really wants to entertain the question of, well, could it be otherwise? How did it come to be this way? Is everybody benefiting from the way that things are? Well, those philosophy questions, why and what is it really, can be quite subversive. And, from Socrates' situation, the kind of question can end up being deadly. So the example is, suppose you ask someone today, what is everything really? Very perfectly good philosophy question. What is everything really? You most likely get the answer, well, everything's made out of matter, or everything's made out of atoms. That's what everybody knows. That's what we all learned in school. That's just the truth of things. But if you had asked an ancient Greek, what is everything really? You would have gotten an answer, the four elements, fire and air and earth and water. That's the answer that, quote unquote, everybody knows. Everybody knows things are made out of the four elements. Everything. Most people don't understand how the four elements can turn into buildings and goats and human beings and so forth. Just like today, most of us really, if we're honest, don't know how all those atoms became cars and buildings and students and teachers. We don't really know all that, except for the more sophisticated and scientific among us. But we all know that everything's made of atoms. Well, ancient Greeks, everybody knew that things were made out of the four elements. So along come philosophers, and they end up asking a weird question. What are the four elements made out of? Really, what are they? I know, fire, earth, and water, but what are those things really? Now, if you ask me, well, what brought Thales lived from 624 to 546 before the Common Era, as far as we know, what possessed him? What made him ask this question? What got under his skin? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows. Aristotle says all human beings by nature desire to know. And philosophy begins in that wonder, that question asking begins from that wondering about things. And what sparks wonder and what inhibits wonder? It's a good question to ask. I'm not sure there's always going to be an answer. But he asked it, what are they made of? And I would be willing to bet that if he asked an ordinary person of his time, hey, listen, I'm wondering about this. What do you think these fire, air, earth, and water are made of really? I think they would have looked at him as if he had two heads. What do you mean, what are they made of? Fire's fire, water's water, air's air, earth is earth. Everybody knows that. Well, he thought about it a little bit. He says, okay, fire, air, earth, and water. is one of the elements more foundational than the others? Is there one of them that somehow is able to take on the properties or the characteristics of the other three? And he thought about it for a bit, and he came up with this idea that all is water. All is water. That's Thales' answer to the question, what is everything really? What are the four elements really? What is the foundation of everything? Now, we know that's not true. And if that's all we take away from Thales, you might wonder, well, why are we even bothering with this guy? He thinks everything's made out of water. That's ridiculous. Not everything's made out of water. It's not the answer so much as the way he developed the answer, the way he asked the question and what kind of an answer he was looking for. He says, well, what is it about water that led Thales to believe that it might be the fundamental element? Well, for one thing, where he lived, he was surrounded by water. He was observant that everybody needs water. Water is a fundamental part of all human life and non-human life and plant life. He knew that it was important. But even more than that, he recognized that water could take on some of the properties of the other elements. Well, when it gets really, really cold, it gets solid. Ice. You can walk on it, like land. And if you agitate it somewhat, it starts to get all kind of vaporous and steamy, floating around, and kind of like air. And if you really get it riled up, well, you don't want to put your hand in it because it'll burn you like fire. So by a process of observation and reflection, Thales came to a conclusion. All is water. Now again, may not be the right conclusion, but what's important is the desire to develop answers for himself, answers that he could at least attempt to verify and understand for himself. Notice what kind of answers he didn't accept. He didn't want to hear about answers that everybody knows. Well, everybody knows it's the four elements. Okay, that they were done questioning, but he wasn't. So he wasn't interested in popular opinion. He wasn't interested in what the authorities told him that he should think. He wasn't interested in answers that were derived from the myths, the stories that organized and made sense of the lives of ancient Greeks. That's not the kind of answer he wanted. He wanted an answer that was natural, a natural kind, not a supernatural answer, and not an authoritative answer, but a natural answer, an answer that could be gotten through his senses, that he could see for himself. He wanted an answer, and this is kind of interesting, that was what we call monistic. He wanted one answer to the question. Fire, air, earth, and water, well, they were the foundation for all the myriad of things that everybody knew in their ordinary lives, like goats and cars, and, well, not cars, but goats and buildings and buckets and boats. Okay, all those things somehow, who knows how, were made up of some combination of those four elements. But what were the four elements made of? He wanted one answer, a single answer to that question. Now, following on his heels is another thinker from the time, Anaximenes, and he said, well, I like this endeavor. I like trying to figure out how we can know things for ourselves. I like that. And I like the idea of a natural kind of answer. I like the idea of a single answer. I don't think it's water. I don't think it's water. I think the answer is, of the four elements, he says, I think it's air or breath, pneuma. So, okay, pneuma. How do you determine that? Well, in addition to simply observing like Thales did, Anaximenes conducted what might be considered a kind of a crude experiment. He thought that if there were a single element that made up the others, a question was still outstanding. Well, what turned that single element into the other three sometimes? What did that? What was at work on that? And he thought there had to be some kind of force that was acting upon the fundamental element to give it the characteristics of the other three. So he thought the answer was a combination of condensation squeezing things down, and rarefaction, spreading things out. So when you squeeze things down and you slow them down, they get liquidy, and maybe even further squeeze them down, they get solid. Further, if you expand them, they start to get vaporous and spread out. So condensation and rarefaction. Condensation, rarefaction, squeezing down, spreading out. Discovered by this crude kind of experiment. You could do it. His experiment could be kind of duplicated by taking your hand, putting it in front of your mouth, and making like you're going to whistle, but don't whistle, and just blow in the palm of your hand. Like that. Just blow in the palm of your hand. How does that feel? Well, it feels cool. But then open your mouth like you're going to say, ah, at the doctor's office. Don't say, ah, just blow. How's it feel? Warm. Like the characteristics of fire. Now, again, you say, but that's not the way things are. Things aren't all made up air. That experiment doesn't really tell you all that much. But again, it's not the answer, but it's the kind of answer that Anaximenes was after, that left a lasting legacy. Not only do we learn by observation, but we also learn by experimentation. We try different things. We manipulate reality to see what secrets it might give up to us. He also recognized a fundamental principle. Quantitative change results in qualitative change. So when you compress the amount of air into a smaller and smaller space, it takes on different characteristics. When you expand the amount of air in a space, it changes the characteristics. And we still have that view today. Another thinker, probably familiar with the name, Pythagoras, famous for the Pythagorean theorem, he thought everything was made out of numbers. Now again, it's not really the case that everything is made out of numbers, but if you remember from your science class days, they had that big chart on the wall, the periodic table of the elements, and it had numbers and it had letters. The letters weren't the important part. That's just to help us remember the names of the different elements. What was important was those numbers. The numbers of protons, neutrons, and electrons in certain ratios. Change those ratios, you might get a liquid, or you might get a gas, or you might get a solid, you might get something that's radioactive, or you might get something that's inert, something that's flammable, something that's not. All by changing the ratios of, or the numbers of, the protons, neutrons, and electrons. That principle, quantitative changes result in qualitative changes, is a fundamental principle of the sciences even today. And then along came another thinker, similar name, Anaximander. And Anaximander, again, said, Thales, Anaximenes, I like the project. I like trying to find a natural answer. I like trying to find a single answer. But you guys still have a problem. Even if everything came from water, or even if everything came from air, where did air come from? Where did the water come from? What is it that allowed itself to have the characteristics, the qualities of air or water or what have you in the first place? What happened? And Anaximander, in addition to observation and in addition to experimentation, thought that if you applied reason, you could figure out how things have to be. So he started thinking about this, all right? Is one of these elements the foundation for the others? That's the question that Thales and Anaximenes had been on about. And he said, well, I think that there must be something that if you operated on with forces, like Anaximenes said, would become air or fire or earth or water. Something that's not itself fire, air, earth, or water, but when acted upon could become fire or air or earth or water. And he called this a pyrrhon, Greek word, pyrrhon. Now, a in Greek at the beginning of the word is like not, right? And pyrrhon is the Greek word that we get words like perimeter from. Perimeter is the measuring of the borders or the boundaries. So this idea of a pyrrhon is the boundless or the unlimited or the indefinite. And he says there's this something or other, not quite a something, that could become a something, a fundamental something like fire, air, earth, and water, one of the four elements. And out of those four elements, all the other things that exist can come into being. But there must be an underlying something or other that's able to do that. Well, okay, so the unlimited, the indeterminate, the indefinite. Okay, here's a question. When Anaximander tells us this, is he telling us anything? What is he really saying when he's saying that underneath the four elements is this something or other, this not quite yet something? Well, what is a not quite yet something? What is a something that's not really a something yet? What is it that we're talking about when we talk about that? Well, the unlimited, the indefinite, no definite thing, no thing, nothing at all. What's he saying? How do you talk about something that doesn't yet have any qualities? Think about that as a challenge. Tell me about something that has absolutely no qualities or properties. You can't even imagine it. So what is Anaximander saying? His reason tells him, well, there must be something that allows itself to be fire, air, earth, and water. But what is that thing when you talk like that? What is it that you're really saying? So this leads us to this first kind of tension. We can recognize Thales and Anaximenes and some others as, well, maybe not full-fledged scientists in the modern sense, but proto-scientists. The beginning of science, the beginning of philosophy really happened at the same time. It's the same thing. Centuries later, at the greatest universities in Europe, they'd still call what you and I would call the science departments, the departments of natural philosophy, the philosophy of nature. Natura is a Latin word where we get our word nature from. Physis is a Greek word where we get our word physics and physical from. And they're just translations of each other in an important sense. So there's this exploration of the natural world, but then there is this drive or this move, maybe even an inevitability, that takes you from that natural physical world to something that doesn't submit to observation or experimentation, but something your reason seems to suggest you can't get away from. And in Anaximander's case, that was a pyrrhon, right? So the physical we can analyze into more and more basic constituents, physical parts. That's naturalism. When I was a kid, we learned that there was, protons, neutrons, and electrons. And then later on, we knew, well, there are subatomic particles. There's quarks and charms and muons and gluons. And, maybe it's even strings or whatever. We keep trying to get more and more basic in our understanding of the building blocks of reality. And you could get going in science without getting all the way back to that foundation of the beginning. You can just get on with the how questions, how fire operates, how water operates, how fluid dynamics operates. You could do very good science without getting back to that fundamental question that Anaximander kept pushing on. But you can't really hit bottom in that way. To try to stay with the natura or the physis, to try to stay at that level, you at a certain point, you start to bleed over into questions that you can answer with the same kind of language as you do in physics. You can't really ultimately answer the why question. Okay, there's water or there's subatomic particles. But why are those things there? There's laws of nature. But why are those laws of nature the way they are? The problem is explaining things scientifically is to explain things in terms of its basic constituents and causes and interrelationships. Right. Well, you already have a set of things that you're working with. Laws and constituent pieces of reality and their causal properties. You have something that you start with. And then you could say and learn a lot of amazing things about how the world works. But you can't really get back to that beginning. Metaphysics, and it's a word we have to be careful about, and we'll say more about that, understanding seems to demand getting back behind those appearances. Now, that's certainly true in science. It's certainly true for the ancient Greeks, true for us. looking around my office, I see books and desks and computers and lamps, and I know because I went to grade school, those things are all made of atoms and subatomic particles. But I don't see atoms or subatomic particles. I don't smell them. I can't touch them. I see a lamp. I see a desk. I see a phone. I see a pen, a laptop. I don't. The appearances are of these different kind of objects, but I know because I've had a little scientific background that beyond those appearances, there's something more true, more fundamental. Well, philosophers say, okay, but what's behind the appearances even of those primary laws and those primary particles that seem to be the building blocks of reality? What's behind those appearances? It seems like you could keep pressing that question. And you could never really be definite about that. And it's not ultimately open to empirical study, not open to proof, if proof equals empirical study. Now, maybe there's other ways to prove things. Some of the most important things in life are not proved empirically, or the trust of friends and so forth goes beyond a certain kind of external study. Well, and in the attempt to try to put your finger on what that is that you're after, like Anaximenes was after, your language can bleed over into the mystical or the poetic or even the religious kind of language, and that's a kind of language that those who are content to stay at the physical, the natural, the scientific kind of level are made uncomfortable by. So you have a bind. We hear these days about tensions between science and religion. Well, they go all the way back to the beginning. All the way back to the beginning. Before the institutions of scientific practices and universities and research labs and peer review and all that stuff, and before church buildings and hierarchies and institutions, before all that, just in the beginning of the essential questioning of human beings. On the one hand, we ask questions because we want answers, and we need answers. But we could always ask additional questions. Our minds seem to be designed, so to speak, to keep pressing those questions, to keep wanting to know more, to keep asking why. And it creates a tension. Well, anyway, this asking of why and what is it really questions leads to the basic branches of philosophy. So it's the second part of the talk today. So let's look at those. I say there are 3 plus 2 primary branches of philosophy. Okay, I could have said 5, right? But okay, so philosophers start often by asking about the nature of the good. Why and what is it really? Where does it come from? We make judgments about things. That's really good that you did that. That was terrible that you did that. Why did you do that? Shame on you. Well, where does that come from? And when philosophers begin to develop more sophisticated questions about that, begin to develop some answers, some theories about that, it generates the field that we call moral philosophy or ethics. In addition, philosophers also want to know about the nature of the true. A lot of people tell us good things, but we want to know, is it true, this thing that's supposed to be good? They're right about that. So what's the nature of that? What is the nature of knowledge? How is it distinguished from mere opinion and falsehoods? What makes true sentences true, true claims true? What makes them true? And when philosophers ask about that, and they develop their questioning and their answering in ever more sophisticated ways, they develop the branch of philosophy called epistemology. And finally, the one that students may not quickly jump on, they might say, oh, I want to know what's good, or I want to know what really counts as true. Ancient philosophers in particular were really interested in the nature of the beautiful. The beautiful. And when philosophers developed their questioning and their answers in more and more sophisticated ways, they developed the field of aesthetics. I've asked this question in class, what do you call that science or that body of knowledge about the beautiful, about beauty? And I've, from time to time, gotten the answer, cosmetology, right? Beauty school. But that cosm, that Greek word cosm, that we get cosmetology from, is also in the word for cosmos, or cosmology, the study of the universe, the whole shebang. Well, that's interesting. How come the same Greek word, the same Greek root, gives us our word for beauty school and gives us our word for the universe, everything. Well, that's because that word signifies something that matters a great deal to us, and it's probably easy to understand what that Greek root cosm means if I tell you the antonym, the opposite, which would be chaos or chaos. Well, what's chaos? Disorder. So if that's the opposite of cosmos, what's cosmos? Order. The Greeks thought in particular that when something was in order, where everything was meant, everything was where it was meant to be, it was beautiful. And if things were disordered or chaotic, they were not beautiful. So, you go to the beautician, the cosmetologist, and what does that person do? They get your look in order. They get you in order, and when they get it in order, you look beautiful. And what's the cosmos like? At least in the ancient mind, it was an orderly home for everything. There was an order to it. Things had their place. Now, the good, the true, and the beautiful, we say in philosophy, are convertible. What does that mean? You can't talk about one without talking about the others. When things are good, it's the way they're truly meant to be, they're in order, and life is beautiful. When things are true, they're true because they're in the right, proper order, they're being the way it's best for them to be. That's true. When life is beautiful, everything is true and good. That's the way they understand that. And, we would kind of giggle if we said, well, I'd like to study philosophy. Well, why is that? Well, I'm interested in the good, the true, and the beautiful. Well, we'd probably say, well, that sounds a little hokey. But you know what? That's too bad. It's too bad. It's maybe the fault of us in academia, I don't know, that we no longer have as our first priority as students seeking the good, the true, and the beautiful. We no longer have that as a priority. It ought to be the priority. Don't you want your life to be good? Don't you want the truth? Don't you want life to be beautiful? Do you understand? Those should be the most important things. Maybe if we answered or tried to answer those questions for ourselves first, maybe it would be much more obvious what we should do with our lives in terms of jobs and our working life and the other things we involved in. What we do is we get all busy working, but we never ask, well, is the work that we're planning to do or doing, is it good? Am I being my true self? Is life, am I where I'm supposed to be? Is life beautiful? Those questions seem to come too late sometimes. It's a shame. So the good, the true, and the beautiful, when the questions are developed and asked and attempts of answers are organized and systematized, we get those important branches of philosophy, the fundamental branches: ethics, how is it best for things to be; epistemology, what is the nature of knowledge and truth; and aesthetics, what is the nature of beauty and art. Those are the three fundamental branches.